G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with the conclusion to the Mindfield, October, Sunday 29.
X or single X, as in the case of some women, also women with Turner syndrome, for example. And we have also the whole problem of intersex. So it's actually quite complicated. The biological bases are already quite complicated. But we get thrust into this gender binary from the time we're born, or dressed in pink or blue, or Q2 or not Q2 or whatever. And this, when we start talking about transgender, part of the problem is there seems to be this battle that, and it seems to be particularly highlighted in relation to male to female transgender. Female to male don't get into the conversation quite as much, and I think these stakes are a little bit different. But we have this conversation where there's this battle over defining what a woman is, and battle about recognizing what a woman is, and it gets back to a question of identity and recognizing somebody's individual identity, rather than looking at gender as a social problem, and looking actually at the ways in which women, from the time we are born and sexed female and then gendered female, live a whole range of social codifications that are really, really oppressive. And so I think the sort of transgender conversation has in part obscured that fact and recast gender as an issue of identity rather than a social question, as Raven was talking about.
Look, this is fascinating to me because this is, I suppose, the initial, my first response whenever I've tried to put consecutive thinking into this particular topic, because it does strike me that feminism did never have a politics. Feminism always represented a kind of politics. Feminism was always a form of epistemology, and there was something about it that always lent itself towards a kind of solidaristic form of relationality. There was something about feminism as such that, if you like, mobilized people together in order to enact and also to embody a particular form of social critique. But we've seen that in so many aspects, I think, of modern life, solidaristic programs and commitments have become, if you like, individual pursuits or forms of identity and personal realization, maybe to the detriment of, if you like, the distinctive form of epistemology and politics. I guess that feminism represented. I guess my question to both of you, it feels to me like these two forms of discourse are incommensurable. I'm having a hard time seeing how they actually join up in terms of a common commitment.
Well, I think we're in a sort of Orwellian form of doublespeak with this issue, and just the very term cisgender that I refuse to use, that transgender women use to describe women born XX or single X. Just that very term, where cisgender is mean that our gender is aligned with our biological sex, I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. That means that there's some sort of gender that is the correct norm that goes with your biological sex, and if you're transgender, there's somehow sort of those wires have been crossed in some way. And every single transgender argument that I've read about this seems to replace some form of there being an essence of woman, and I'm caricaturing a little bit, and I know that that phraseology will be objected to by some, but that there's some sort of hardwiring that has gone the other way, so has gone trans rather than cis. So we need to correct the physical appearance to go with that wiring, and for me that's a completely nonsensical argument, because we're born in the bodies we're born in. There's no such thing as a wrong body, and not all transgender people will say that either. But we're born in the bodies we're born with, and I'm actually personally appalled that to feel all right in the world, some people feel they have to, surgically rearrange parts of their body, something I would call genital mutilation, and then take synthetic hormones. And we know the damage that synthetic hormones, taking synthetic hormones from a very young age can do to people. We know the damage it's done to women in the pill and HRT and so on. So I'm appalled that we're actually forcing people into this sort of binary once again. When I was a little girl, I used to wish I was a boy. I used to, pray to a God that I didn't think existed, but I said, just in case you exist, God, could I wake up a boy? It wasn't because I wanted to grow a beard and have a penis. It's because, boys had all the fun. They got to play all the good games. They got treated better. They took up more space. I understood very, very young what patriarchy was about, and I've talked to a lot of my friends about this, my female friends, and they have talked of having the same experience. Now, were we little girls and little girls today, we might be getting called transgender children, and then maybe some doctor would want to prescribe us puberty blockers, and I find that very, very concerning.
Raymond, I think we should let you respond to that. I think the concept of transgender is itself a confusing one. It covers 4 or 5 different situations, and politics involved are different. A common meaning for it now is people who refuse any position in gender relations are trying to explode out of any gender categories at all. There are some people who are trying to blend what the culture defines as masculinity with what the culture defines as femininity. I think there's quite a lot of people who do that to one extent or another. Not all of them get called transgender, but some do. There are then people who make or attempt a transition between the social position of a woman and the social position of a man, which may or may not involve surgical intervention and chemical treatment. And then there are people who, in one way or another, are trying to play with the gender categories that the culture gives them, are trying to queer the notion of gender, for instance, move around or simply subvert the categories in some way. Now, the one category of transgender gets attached to all of those kinds of situations, and it's not surprising that we get confused about it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that there's a sort of an alphabet soup globalization of identities, yes, and I agree with Raywin that a lot of different types of expressions of performance of identity get lumped into transgender. We have travestidos in Latin America. We have lady boys in Southeast Asia. We have the heteros in India. Now they've often identified as a third sex or as effeminate men or other sorts of configurations, and have performed that identity in socially less or more acceptable ways. But they're now being sort of folded into this transgender trope. In this global movement. And a colleague of mine actually had to testify in a US court for travestidos from Mexico who were seeking asylum in the US. And they had to frame themselves as transgender, even though they were not. They were effeminate cross-dressing men who were being abused because of that. And they were seeking asylum because of that, but they were not transgender, and they did not identify as transgender, but to correspond to the way we sort of have to stick things into gender categories, they had to perform that way. And I would add that it's not only transgender people who are questioning the binaries. I think feminists and lesbians have been doing that for decades.
You are listening to the Mindfield, which is rapidly coming to an end for the radio portion of it. Our guest, Raywin Connell, is Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney, and Bronwyn Winter, Associate Professor in European Studies and International Studies programs, also at the University of Sydney. So they are colleagues. We have just enough time not to ask anything quite serious, I think. It's quite an awkward amount of time that we have left. So we will have a podcast element to the show where we'll be able to unpack some of this in a little bit more detail. But Scott, I might just say, before to finish the radio show, well, give us some final thoughts that would set up, you think, the themes that are probably most thorny out of this. That, for those on the podcast, we will go on and discuss. But for those who are not, are the questions we might go away thinking about from what you've heard?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that just strikes me immediately is that part of the program, part of the politics of feminism in the 1970s and early 1980s was a form of liberation from the strictures, from the restraints of gender, and to find new forms, both of social belonging and mutual identification that didn't fit neatly into those stereotypes. I just wonder if the fact that it seems as though we're increasingly forced back on, to some extent, quite stereotypical notions of gender, does that say something about the political failure, if you like, of liberatory feminism in the meantime? Is this just the fate of all political projects?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I will say I agree with that in principle. I think that we're overlooking the particularities of the question as it relates to sport.
Yes.
Though, and that's something I think we should visit as well. Anyway, we'll do that in the podcast part of the show. This has been The Mindfield. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, good-o. Well, yeah, politics and sport. I don't understand where people are coming from when they try and float the idea that sport and politics are eternally separate. I mean, I can remember when there was a place called White South Africa, and the White South Africans used to like to play football, you know, like rugby football, ellipsoidal football. And they came to Australia. They had a team called the Springboks, and all of the Springboks were white. And the Australian Union movement and the Australian Labor movement, the Australians who recognise that human beings are human beings, not only boycott watching the matches, they put on great big protests. And that was a political action that hinged around sport. So I don't know why anybody says that it's wrong for sport to find itself being drawn into politics. I seem to recall there have been issues of transgendered male to female individuals competing in female teams and female competitions and being regarded as unfair because they've grown up under the influence of testosterone, they've built themselves a great big set of muscles on a big bony frame, and then they've gone and undergone changes. And as the lady said, it's not a good idea to mess with your hormonal system for decades at a stretch. You know, talk to some of the women who took the pill in the 1960s and 70s and see how they got on afterwards. The idea that just because there's a pharmaceutical industry and there's a plastic surgical industry and we haven't had enough work for the plastic surgeons since World War II finished, and therefore the plastic surgeons got into reconstructing shit that really doesn't need to be reconstructed to employ themselves. Therefore, we have this whole segment of the gender-confused community who are being encouraged to go and have really, really major multi-stage surgery because they think that they're trapped in a wrong sex body. I mean, how does that come to be? Does the God they don't believe in make a mistake? Because that's what most of them say. How come there's so many long cultural traditions of transgendered individuals in countries where the religion practices comebackology or reincarnation theology? Could it be that you've got these little old lady Ouija board operators who are on the point of death, and as they lift up out of their body and they're greeted by their recording angel and their guardian angel, and they're supposed to go toward the light and find out, you know, what the downstream consequences were of every decision they made, they say, no, 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 I don't want to sit on a sunbeam and think about the meaning of life before reincarnating. I'm off to the labour ward. I'm going to come back now. And they get there and find not only that every baby has already got a soul from the moment of conception, but there's a whole lot of other Ouija board operators who want to be reincarnated immediately. And when you get a baby with APGARs of 1 and 0 and it's blue on the resus table, that's when all the disembodied little old lady Ouija board operators dive into a infant neonate that was about to die. And they crank up the respirations and they get the heartbeat going and the baby turns pink again. And then when it's 3 years old, it looks itself in the mirror and says, what the fuck is this? I'm going to go and see a doctor and get that cut off. That might be what's going on. But as antibiotics fail, the idea of elective surgery goes back to having a 30% death rate like it did in the 1930s. And I think this is a passing fad, a first world ephemeral issue. It's going to go away. But in the meantime, what do we do about the Australian same-sex marriage survey? A specimen of which I happen to have in my possession currently. But you see, it's a voluntary postal survey, so it's a matter of liberty and responsibility, and I have the liberty to refuse the responsibility of having anything at all to do with trying to change the definition of marriage from being a social license to have potentially procreative sex. That's what marriage is. It's what it's always been. It's what it always will be. So I have no inclination to vote yes. On the other hand, the No campaign's been run by a bunch of bombastic, homophobic, religious extremists whose agenda I have no wish to further. Ciao.